Еще попытка. Здесь пошел прием. Все.
What happens when a convicted murderer becomes a cult hero in MMA? Welcome to Legends of the Octagon. We've covered some wild stories on this channel, from fighters battling their demons to those who rose from nothing to make it to the top. But today's story, it takes things to a whole different level. Maxim Novoselov, better known as Mad Max, wrestled bears, fought in underground no-rules death matches, became a YouTube star while still in prison, and somehow built a legitimate MMA career after serving time for murder. And just when it seemed like he might finally turn things around, he threw it all away again. This is the unbelievable, violent, and ultimately tragic story of one of Russian MMA's most dangerous men. Stick around. You'll want to hear how this ends. Maxim Novoselov was born on May 15, 1973, in Trek-Gorny, a closed city in Russia. Trek-Gorny wasn't your typical Soviet town. It was home to a nuclear weapons plant and completely shut off from outsiders. You needed government clearance to visit. Sounds mysterious. But according to Novoselov, growing up there was painfully boring. He described Trek-Gorny as its own planet. Isolated, closed off from the world. Kids had to make their own fun, and in Trek-Gorny, that usually meant fighting. The city was divided into districts, and the kids from each area regularly clashed. Every weekend, groups of kids would organize fights against other districts. It wasn't exactly life or death, but these battles were rough and often left their mark. This culture of constant street fighting shaped Novoselov from an early age. He wanted to be the toughest, and street brawls quickly turned into serious martial arts training. By his teens, he was already focusing on combat sports, but he wasn't training for sport. He was preparing for life. As a teenager in the late 1980s and early 1990s, Novoselov set his sights on the military. Like most young men in the Soviet Union, conscription was inevitable. But Novoselov wasn't just going to do his time. He wanted to stand out. In 1991, he was conscripted into the Russian army and became part of the elite airborne forces. These were no ordinary troops. They were trained in brutal, close-quarters combat by hardened veterans who'd fought in Vietnam and Afghanistan. Novoselov thrived in this environment. His size, strength, and aggression made him an ideal soldier. After 2 years of service, he left the army but stayed briefly as a military instructor. Then he returned home to Trek-Gorny. The problem was, there weren't many options for a guy like Novoselov. No jobs, no opportunities, just a dead-end town with little to offer. So Novoselov did what he knew best. He fought. He began competing in brutal underground fights, often organized by crime bosses and held in abandoned warehouses. These weren't sporting events. They were savage, no-rules brawls where fighters could use whatever tactics they wanted. No refs, no rules, no limits. Novoselov was a natural. His sheer size and military combat training gave him a huge advantage. He quickly made a name for himself in these no-holds-barred matches. According to Novoselov, it wasn't unusual for losers to be carted off to intensive care or worse. He claimed that some fighters who died in these underground fights were simply buried in quarries and forgotten. The risk was enormous, but so was the reward. Novoselov won enough money to buy his first car. It wasn't a fortune, but it was a better payday than any job he could find in Trek-Gorny. Still, fighting didn't offer long-term security, and Novoselov wanted more. With his skills and reputation, it wasn't long before Novoselov was recruited into more serious criminal activity. He started collecting debts for drug dealers and participating in robberies. Given his physical presence and combat background, he was the perfect enforcer. But his involvement in the criminal underworld escalated fast. Novoselov became embroiled in a violent gang war. The conflict reached its peak during a standoff in an abandoned house. Tensions boiled over when a rival gang member reached for a machine gun. Novoselov acted instantly, wrestling the gun away and opening fire. 2 men were killed. Several others were wounded. And just like that, Novoselov was arrested and charged with murder. The trial was brutal. Prosecutors pushed for the death penalty, but the judge handed down a 14-year sentence instead. Novoselov was sent to a Russian penal colony, one of the harshest prison systems in the world. Prison didn't tame Novoselov. If anything, it made him more dangerous. He participated in underground prison fights, organized by inmates and sometimes condoned by guards. These fights were even more brutal than the ones outside. There were no breaks, no tap-outs, and no one to step in if things went too far. Fights ended when one man was unconscious, or worse. The stakes were different inside. Instead of money, winners got cigarettes, cheap boots, and small luxuries. Novoselov quickly became one of the most feared fighters in the prison system. But with that reputation came danger. Other inmates saw him as a target. Novoselov carried a sharpened toothbrush as a weapon and rigged fishing lines in his cell to alert him to nighttime attacks. Despite his violent reputation and infractions for fighting, Novoselov was released early, after serving 10 years of his 14-year sentence. Novoselov walked out of prison in 2003, a free man. But the world had changed. MMA was becoming mainstream. For the first time, there was a legal, regulated way for fighters to make money. Just a week after his release, Novoselov stepped into a gym and fought in an unofficial match. In 2004, he made his professional MMA debut. He lost his first fight by decision, but for a guy who'd spent a decade behind bars, it wasn't a bad performance. By 2005, he earned his first pro win. Things were looking up. Then came a 3-year gap. During this time, Novoselov worked as a military instructor for private European units. According to him, his training was so intense that Austrian special forces quit after one session. Whether that's true or not, Novoselov eventually returned to fighting. He traveled to Japan and fought in unsanctioned MMA bouts. It was there that he earned the nickname Mad Max, thanks to his savage fighting style. Unlike other fighters who struggled to get paid by shady promoters, Novoselov had no such problems. His past as a debt collector made sure of that. He also competed in combat sambo, winning the European Championship in the over 100 kilograms category. But once again, the money wasn't enough. And once again, Novoselov returned to crime. In 2012, he was arrested and sentenced to 3.5 years in prison for patronizing the drug business. The details are murky. Some sources suggest he was dealing. Others imply he was deeply involved in the trade. While in prison, Novoselov convinced the leadership to allow him to set up a training camp. He trained 40 inmates in combat sports, turning them into a formidable fighting unit. YouTubers filmed these sessions, and the footage shows him teaching knife and axe combat. It wasn't exactly the Gulag, but it was far from a rehabilitation program. After his release, Novoselov found unexpected fame on YouTube. Russian MMA channels like True Gym MMA featured him in videos that racked up millions of views. He fought in gimmick matches, including one where he faced 3 opponents at once. He wrestled bears. Yes, actual bears. He stood in an octagon with 2 attack dogs. One of those videos alone pulled in over 2 million views. At 42, Novoselov returned to pro MMA. His record was 1-2-1. From there, he went on a 12-fight win streak, although most of his opponents were inexperienced and undersized. In 2019, he fought a debuting fighter who looked more like an accountant than an MMA athlete. The size difference was laughable. There was almost a fight between Novoselov and Vyacheslav Datsyk, another infamous figure in Russian MMA, but the bout fell through when Datsyk was sent back to prison. Novoselov seemed to have found his niche: low-level MMA fights and YouTube stunts. It was dangerous but not nearly as reckless as his past life. But Novoselov couldn't stay out of trouble. In 2022, he was arrested again, this time for the rape of an 18-year-old girl. According to reports, Novoselov met the girl at a nightclub. He offered her a ride home, but instead abducted her and assaulted her. Novoselov pleaded not guilty. He claimed he'd been drugged and didn't remember anything from that night. The judge didn't buy it. He was sentenced to 5 years in a penal colony, his 3rd stint in Russia's harsh prison system. At this point, any chance of redemption was gone. Novoselov had sealed his legacy as a violent criminal who couldn't escape his own self-destruction. Maxim Novoselov's story could have ended differently. He had the chance to walk away from crime. He had the chance to build a legitimate career in MMA. And for a time, it looked like he might. But in the end, Mad Max couldn't leave his past behind. His life is a cautionary tale about wasted potential and self-destruction. At Legends of the Octagon, we bring you the most extreme stories from the world of combat sports. Some inspiring, others tragic. If you found this story worth your time, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. There's a lot more to come. And drop a comment below. Who should we cover next? Legends, villains, comeback kings? Let us know.